there, it's Amanda with World in a Nutshell, and today we're going to be talking about the French Revolution, from Thomas Jefferson's involvement to the revolutionaries' attempt to change time as we know it. Are you ready? France before the Revolution was dealing with a lot of economic and social problems. First of all, the country was neatly divided into three estates. The first estate, the clergy or the church, made their fortunes from collecting the obligatory tithes or offerings from each French family, usually about 10% of a family's income. The second estate, the nobles, they made their money from collecting dues and fees from the peasants in the countryside and enjoyed special privileges like hunting rights and access to high offices in the military. Another perk, these first two estates that represented less than 4% of the population and owned roughly 40% of the land, didn't have to pay taxes. That burden fell to the rest of the population, collectively called the Third Estate, which made up more than 96% of the population, or roughly 27 million people. These included shop owners, lawyers, doctors, merchants, laborers in the city, peasants in the countryside, essentially anybody who wasn't part of the First and Second Estate. The poorest of this group, who lived in the cities in the late 18th century, suffered from the high price of bread. Poor harvests in 1788-89 had caused grain shortages, resulting in high prices for flour and hence high prices for bread. Some families were paying more than 80% of their income on bread, which was their main source of food. Not understanding the concepts of supply and demand, they blamed the monarchy for the high prices, especially France's queen, Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette was the daughter of the Austrian Empress Maria Theresa, and she had been married off to France's King Louis XVI in order to forge a strategic alliance between the two countries. The French queen was known for her extravagance, wearing a new, amazing dress every day, hosting lavish parties, gambling, and even play acting as a humble milkmaid in her own little faux hamlet, built on the grounds of the magnificent Versailles Palace, where she lived with her husband, Louis XVI, around 12 miles away from Paris. This will become important later. Like the poor people in Paris, the French monarchy was also suffering from severe financial issues, mostly because of the many wars that had been fought under Louis XIV, XV, and XVI, including the War of Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War against Britain and Prussia, and in retaliation for Britain's defeat of France in the 7 Years' War, helping the American colonists win their Revolutionary War against Britain's King George III. Participating in the American Revolution was particularly inspirational to the French revolutionaries because the new American government had incorporated Enlightenment principles in their new government. For instance, the idea that government is responsible to protect people's natural rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that had been written in the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson, and also the installation of a republic in place of a monarchy. But wait a minute, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. The wars left the French government in deep debt, which required half of the government's expenditures to go to pay for the interest alone on the debts. To solve the problem, King Louis XVI called a meeting of representatives of the three estates in order to try to change the taxation laws to get money from the very wealthy, tax-exempt clergy and nobility. The Estates General, as it was called, had not been called for more than 170 years. On May 5th, 1789, representatives from all three estates arrived at a makeshift meeting hall in Versailles, armed with carefully compiled grievances or cahiers de doléances. Among the grievances were pleas to end the taxation, both direct and indirect, for instance, the gabelle tax on salt, or requirements the peasants provide free labor to repair roads, and also demands to end censorship, to end noble privileges, to guarantee personal liberties, and also the enactment of fairer legal codes. However, despite the fact that the Third Estate represented the vast majority of the population, and even though they were represented by twice the number of people in the Estates General, each of the three estates received equal votes. This guaranteed that the first two estates would outvote the Third Estate in every decision. The representatives of the Third Estate, therefore, proclaimed themselves the National Assembly and took over legislative decisions. When they returned to the meeting hall, however, they discovered that the doors were locked. Not discouraged, they reconvened a few blocks away at a royal tennis court. And it was here that they promised that they would not disband until a constitution was written. This iconic image, by the way, is the tennis court oath painted by Jacques-Louis David, and it shows the passion and the historical significance of this pact. The king finally gave in to the National Assembly and ordered members of the other two estates to join them. At the same time, however, he dispatched troops, foreign troops, around Versailles and Paris, and fired his very popular finance minister, Jacques Necker. Parisians worried that these actions were part of a plot to disband the National Assembly, and they began rioting. Angry mobs in Paris broke into the Invalides to gather weapons and then headed to the Bastille prison, where it was rumored that the ammunition was being held. The Bastille prison had long been a symbol of tyranny because the king theoretically could imprison anybody without any trial. After killing the warden and the guards and sticking their decapitated heads on pikes, the mobs burst into the Bastille prison and released the handful of prisoners that were being held there. This single event signaled the beginning of the French Revolution, and this is commemorated every year in France with fireworks and parades. The revolution also moved to the countryside. In reaction to rumors that the nobility were planning to take advantage of the chaos in Paris in order to take over land and strengthen their control over the peasantry, every suspicious movement, a puff of smoke in the distance, strangers walking through the fields, anything that seemed out of the ordinary set off violence in the countryside. Peasants especially targeted manors, burning them down to the ground, along with the records of the debts that they owed the lords. Though the peasants weren't murdering noble families, the disorder in the countryside terrified nobles who had traveled to Paris to attend the meetings. Hoping to appease the peasants, one by one, the nobles at the National Assembly agreed to give up all of their feudal rights, privileges, and tax exemptions. The clergymen also agreed to abolish church tithes. All citizens would now enjoy equal punishments, equal access to civil service, and equal taxation. In just one night, August 4th, 1789, the Ancien Régime, the old order, was dismantled, and the new order was codified a couple weeks later when the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen was presented to the National Assembly. Written by the Marquis de Lafayette with a lot of input from Thomas Jefferson, the author of the American Declaration of Independence, the document declared that men are born and remain free and equal in rights, Article 1, and that the aim of all political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. Article 3 dictated that sovereignty resides in the nation and that no one could exercise authority that doesn't come directly from the nation. France, in essence, had become a constitutional monarchy. But this new system could not be effective as long as the king continued to live in remote luxury far outside of Paris. Frustrated by bread shortages, high prices, and what seemed like royal indifference to the suffering in Paris, A large, determined crowd of market women, nicknamed the Fish Ladies, since many worked as fishmongers, marched from Paris to Versailles, 12 miles away, armed with brooms, pitchforks, sticks, pikes, and other more serious weapons, to confront the king, to acquire grain that they believed was being secretly stashed in the palace, and to get their revenge on the hated queen by cutting off her head, tearing out her heart, and frying her liver. At one point, the crowds had breached the gates of the palace and burst in with one group of angry women, making it to Marie Antoinette's bedroom, and frustrated that she had escaped, they stabbed her bed instead. Once tempers had cooled, the royal family was escorted to the Tuileries Palace in Paris, never again to return to their extravagant home in Versailles. With the monarchy under control, the National Assembly turned on the church, the First Estate. In November 1789, the government took over all church property and closed the monasteries, and they used the land as collateral for a new paper currency called assignat. In July the following year, they passed the civil constitution of the clergy that dictated that bishops and priests would now be elected by the people and would be paid by the state rather than tithes. Clergymen would also have to take loyalty oaths in support of the new government. More than half of France's refractory or non-juror priests refused to take the oath, which turned them into targeted enemies of the state. Meanwhile, in Paris, food riots continued, and the king, Louis XVI, his wife Marie Antoinette, and their 2 children attempted to escape from their confinement in the Tuileries Palace to freedom in Austria, where Marie Antoinette's brother, Leopold VII, was emperor, disguised as a chariot driver and a nanny. The escape went horribly wrong. The royal family was easily recognized and arrested 70 miles from the border in the French city of Varennes, and they were escorted back to Paris. Making matters worse, Austria and Prussia threatened that they would go to war against France if any harm came to the royal family. That is, as long as the other powers of Europe joined them. It wasn't necessarily a declaration of war, but an attempt to prevent the revolutionary spirit from spreading across Europe, and also to satisfy the émigrés, that is, the nobles who had taken refuge in their countries. But rather than deter the revolutionaries, it just strengthened their resolve. The next year, the French government, now called the Legislative Assembly, preemptively declared war on Austria, pushing the other European powers to join together in a powerful coalition to bring France to its knees. The impending war made the revolutionaries a lot more aware of the need to unify and to eliminate internal threats, including possible traitors who might join foreign enemies and turn against their own countrymen. To prevent this possibility, thousands of armed revolutionaries stormed the Tuileries Palace, where Louis XVI and his family were being kept, and massacred hundreds of Swiss guards. But the family escaped, and they sought protection from, of all places, the National Assembly. After their escape from the Tuileries Palace, the royal family was locked up in the Temple prison. Any remaining fiction of the king's power ended at this point. Louis XVI was formally stripped of all of his titles and would now simply be called Citizen Louis Capet. 2 weeks later, news reached Paris that Prussian armies had crossed the French borders and were advancing on the capital, escalating tensions and fears that a fifth column was planning to betray France from within. These fears were exacerbated by people like Georges Danton, the Minister of Justice, and the radical journalist Jean-Paul Marat, who urged citizens in his newspaper L'Ami du Peuple, Friend of the People, to kill all imprisoned counter-revolutionaries who he claimed were plotting to help the invading Prussian army. On September 2nd, mobs of sans-culottes, that is, Working class men who couldn't afford to buy the fancy breeches or culottes worn by the upper classes broke into prisons and killed more than 1,000 men, women, and children being held in there. The Legislative Assembly, meanwhile, was busy constructing the new post-monarchy government. On September 22nd, 1792, the First French Republic was established, an event that would be commemorated as the first day in the new calendar. More on that later. The Legislative Assembly then became the National Convention. Now that the former traitorous king was officially useless, a vote was called to decide on his fate. Some of the revolutionaries wanted to exile Louis Capet or keep him in prison because they feared that an execution would further rile up the European monarchs. The more radical members of the assembly, though, wanted his head on a platter. But before I tell you the outcome of the vote, here's a little overview of the players. The seats in the National Convention had been divided into three groups. On the right sat the conservatives who supported the king. Moderates sat in the middle, and the radicals who distrusted the king and wanted a republic sat on the left. This, incidentally, is where we get our current designations of right, left, and center on the political spectrum. Dominating the left and the revolution in general were the members of the Jacobin Club, who had split themselves into two factions. The more moderate Girondins, who represented the interests of the bourgeoisie and merchants and favored free market, laissez-faire economics and law and order because they really feared the power of the mobs, and the radical Montagnards, or mountain, who earned their name because they sat in the highest benches in the assembly. They represented the interests of the working class in Paris, the sans-culottes, and favored price controls to help the poor in the city and revolution at any cost, even at the expense of people's individual rights. This group was led by Maximilien Robespierre and included members like Georges Danton and Jean-Paul Marat, who were mentioned before. They had the power of the violent sans-culottes behind them, and because of that, the radical regicides, or king killers, got their way. After a contentious trial in December 1792, it was decided by a vote of 380 to 310 that the king must be killed within 24 hours for conspiring against the liberty of the nation and the security of the state. Louis must die so the nation may live, cried Robespierre. On January 21st, 1793, at 10:22 a.m., Louis Capet was guillotined. To take control of the anticipated backlash, the National Convention preemptively declared war on Britain, Holland, and Spain and initiated a nationwide draft. The draft was fiercely resisted by counter-revolutionaries, especially in religiously conservative provinces far from Paris, like Vendée, Lyon, Marseille, Brittany, Nantes, and Verdun, where insurrectionist royalists and priests joined angry peasants to bring back the king and the old regime. The uprisings were violently put down. In Vendée alone, more than 170,000 people were killed over the next 3 years, roughly 20% of the region's population. To maintain control of the country, the National Convention created the Committee of Public Safety, which would be led eventually by Maximilien Robespierre. As the name suggests, the job of the 9-member committee was to ensure the safety of the French people by managing the military, managing the supply of food, and most importantly, ridding the country of dangerous counter-revolutionaries, beginning with the Girondins, who were purged from the convention between May 31st and June 2nd. The activities of the Committee of Public Safety ramped up considerably after a courageous woman, a supporter of the Girondins called Charlotte Corday, murdered the man who she believed was responsible for much of the violence in France, Jean-Paul Marat, the author of the radical newspaper L'Ami du Peuple that had encouraged people to kill prisoners, leading to the September massacres. The murder was immortalized in the painting by Jacques-Louis David, representing Marat slumping in his bathtub where he had spent most of his time because of a chronic skin infection, still grasping the letter that Corday had used to get access to the revolutionary. Most importantly, Marat was posed in the same way that Renaissance artist Michelangelo had posed Jesus dead in his mother's arms in the famous Pieta statue. Marat, the martyr, was being celebrated as a modern-day messiah, and the reaction to his murder was swift and intense. On September 5th, 1793, the convention announced that terror would now be the order of the day. Force would be used against French citizens to ensure compliance with the laws, including the law of the maximum, which set the maximum price of bread, soap, oil, firewood, and iron to combat the soaring prices of essential goods and food shortages. This decree, by the way, would end up leading to hoarding, reduced production, and a thriving black market, which would ultimately worsen the shortages. The other law was the law of suspects, which allowed the Committee of Public Safety to arrest anyone thought to be an enemy or anybody who lacked what they called civic virtue. The accused would be judged in very quick, unjust trials, and the guilty would be executed by guillotine. Ironically, this punishment was considered more humane and equitable for execution because of its swiftness. Tens of thousands of people were imprisoned or executed in the course of this new reign of terror, including 21 Girondists and thousands of nobles and clergymen. And on October 16, 1793, the hated Queen Marie Antoinette. The greatest number of victims of the guillotine, however, came from the working classes, commoners or peasants or shopkeepers who were accused of draft dodging, hoarding food, treason, or even just criticizing the government. The main aim of these gruesome spectacles was to instill fear and obedience among the masses. As Robespierre proclaimed, there are only two parties in France, the people and its enemies. We must exterminate those miserable villains who are eternally conspiring against the rights of man. We must exterminate all our enemies. Free from all resistance, the radical revolutionaries set out to completely restructure society by changing all measurements to the metric system, for instance, and by creating a new calendar. The French Republican calendar played a role in the dechristianization of France by starting on September 22nd, 1792, the first day of the Republic, or year one, instead of beginning with the birth of Jesus, as our calendar does now. 12 months of the year would be made up of 3 10-day weeks, or decades, with the 10th day, or decadi, replacing Sunday as the day of rest. This would also vastly increase productivity. Each day was then divided into 10 hours, each hour into 100 decimal minutes, each decimal minute into 100 decimal seconds. And the names of the months would be indicated by names that reflected the seasons or the temperatures. Names like snow or rain or wind, or the month of germination or flowers, or heat, thermidor, which fell, of course, in the summertime. Religious festivals and saint days would now be replaced by secular holidays and celebrations, like the Festival of Reason. Organized by artist Jacques-Louis David, again, who painted the tennis court oath and the death of Marat, and Jacques Hébert, the chief spokesman of the Sans-Culottes. This would be the new state-sponsored atheistic civic religious celebration aimed at replacing Christianity with Enlightenment ideals. The main event was held at Notre Dame Cathedral, which had been transformed into a temple of reason. The altar was now dedicated to liberty and decorated with a papier-mâché mountain, a flame of truth, and busts of Benjamin Franklin, Voltaire, and Rousseau. Presiding over the festivities was a woman dressed as the priestess of philosophy, draped with a white Roman tunic, wearing a Phrygian bonnet. Churches across France were also turned into temples of reason after they had been badly vandalized and stripped of the valuable gold and silver religious symbols. After the Festival of Reason, however, Robespierre, who distrusted atheists, recognized that the population wasn't quite ready for such an abstract, intellectually enlightened celebration. Recalling Voltaire's quote, "If God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him," Robespierre reasoned that godlike figures would better bring order and serve as a more seamless replacement for the Catholic God. The following year, therefore, the cult of reason was replaced by the more deistic cult of the supreme being. Celebrated June 8, 1794, by an even more massive state-sponsored celebration in Paris, again meticulously planned by Jacques-Louis David, this event would no longer be restricted to the walls of Notre Dame, but would be held in the vast Champ de Mars, this time proudly leading the procession up the huge man-made mountain to the massive altar of the nation was Robespierre. Oh, the optics were bad. Hecklers accused him of wanting to be seen not just as the dictator of France, but as a god. By this time, the revolution had already started to eat its own children. Some of the most ardent supporters of the revolution, including Danton, Desmoulins, and even Jacques Hébert, the man who spoke for the Sans-Culottes, had urged the killing of the king and even helped organize the cult of reason, were guillotined, leaving only Robespierre to lead the revolution. As he stood upon that artificial mountain, representing the Republic's triumphs, he promised, "Tomorrow we will renew our combat with vice and tyranny." 2 days later, the National Convention passed the Law of 22 Prairial, which accelerated the terror by broadening the definition of enemies of the people to include anyone accused of destroying liberty, betraying the Republic, or even spreading false news. They also suspended defendants' rights to a public trial, a lawyer, or the right to plead their own self-defense. There would be only 2 possible verdicts now: acquittal or death. No more imprisonment, no more fines. The number of executions doubled, leaving public squares like the Place de la Révolution, now the Place de la Concorde, so thoroughly soaked with blood that they had to move the executions to different parts of Paris. Then, on July 27, 1794, Robespierre made a fateful speech, announcing that he had a list of internal enemies who would all be killed the next day. After the executions of the most fervent and loyal revolutionaries, no one felt safe. Robespierre was finally accused of tyranny and plotting against the revolution and was arrested. While in custody, Robespierre desperately tried to commit suicide by shooting himself in the face, but he only succeeded in shattering his own jaw. The next day, July 28, 1794, 10 Thermidor, year 2, already in agonizing pain, Robespierre was executed, ending the Reign of Terror. The more moderate Thermidorians, as the people who arrested Robespierre were called, repealed the law of suspects and the law of 22 Prairial. They emptied the prisons of political prisoners, restored purge deputies, relaxed price controls, and initiated a white terror, arresting both former Jacobins and perceived radicals on the left and royalists on the right. In November 1795, the unpopular Thermidorians were replaced by the less effective Directory, which created a new constitution with a bicameral legislature and continued the war with the rest of Europe. Many of the ideals of the revolution would be carried on with the rise of Napoleon in 1799, but that's the topic of another video. Let me know in the comments if you think I omitted anything important from the French Revolution, or if there are any parallels that you see with today's society. And until then, have a great day!